Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Deserts of Plenty. My name is Ralph. Deserts of Plenty is a podcast about making our way in this crazy world, in a world where we're inundated with calories, but are lacking in nutrition, awash in information, but devoid of knowledge and facts. And everywhere you go, there's experiences to be had of all kinds, but we're lacking in connection. In short, all the things that make our lives more, pleasurable or easy or enjoyable are killing us. I mean, there's just a huge epidemic of loneliness, disconnection. It's interesting. Japan seems to be about a decade ahead of us. And I remember reading, maybe like 15 years ago about how Japanese, like younger adults were not having sex anymore. And I was like, that's bizarre. What's going on? And then about a decade later, that started happening here. The rates of, um, I guess, the sexual culture, whatever, that the rates of sex in younger people started to decline. Probably for the first time since the invention and mass marketing of the birth control pill. I don't know about that, but that seems likely. Um, and another thing that's I was reading about that's happening in Japan is particularly older people are committing petty crimes so that they can go to jail. And the reason they do that is because they are so hungry for a community. And the only way they can get one is to, break the law. And by breaking the law, they're put into jail and then they have a community. Was even one story I was reading about an elderly man who stole a bike and rode the bike to the police station and turned himself in so that he could go to jail and be with people. And I think about that as like, that's so awful and yet makes so much sense. And I think that's likely where we're headed. I mean, it's like one of the things now, like how your social circle, how that is almost as big a predictor of your mortality or one's mortality as smoking is, because, loneliness and being cut off from social ties. I can only imagine how awful that must be. And in the world, there are these zones called blue zones. Like the island of Crete, there's I think Okinawa or one of the Japanese islands where it's very, very common for people to live into their hundreds, or much more common than it is in the rest of the world. And so I guess the main content or reason for this happening was diet, high fish diet, good oils, plant-based diets. But the other thing that's common in these blue zones where people live to be centenarians is they don't discard old people. They are part of the community. They're revered, or at least respected. They're not tossed aside. They're not like burdens. I'm like, ugh, here comes someone in their 80s. So yeah, I think the idea that in Canada, North America, in a few years, people will commit crimes solely so that they can go to jail, prison, and have a community of people, I don't think is so far-fetched. So today, what I wanted to chat about is the idea of whether something is good or bad. So an event that happens to you, is it good or bad? There's this, and I'm pretty sure it's Chinese allegory or story or saying, I guess, but it goes like this. There was a man, a Chinese farmer, and one day his horse broke its rope and ran off, and the villagers went, "Oh, that's bad," and he said, "We'll see." And a few days later, his horse came back, leading 4 wild colts, and the villagers said, "That's great," and he said, "We'll see." And a few days later, his son was trying to break one of these wild colts, and the colt threw him, and the boy broke his leg. And the villagers said, "No, that's what a rotten stroke of luck." And he said, "We'll see." And a few days later, the army came through and took every able-bodied man to be into the army, but they didn't take his son because his leg was broken. And they said, "What luck?" And he said, "We'll see." And yes, there's like just that idea of something that happens now. You don't know really if it's going to be good or bad until we see what happens. Now, of course, I'm not talking about the real terrible things that happen to us, the death of loved ones or serious medical conditions. Although I know from my own life, and I've talked about this before, two of the greatest things that happened to me in retrospect, which were terrible at the time, was being around 17 and being diagnosed as an epileptic. But that meant I had to take care of myself and do regular blood work and see a physician once a year. And so that led to catching things that might have gone on to cause me great harm later in life. But I found them early. And so I was able to change my diet. And now I'm 56 and I'm not on a single medication. And I know that's rare because I was at my doctor's office. This is actually a few years ago, like 5 years ago. And my doctor is a teaching doctor. And so I always see a resident first. And the resident asked me to see my pills. And I was like, I'm not on any pills. And she was flabbergasted is the word. She was like, what? You're the only patient I've seen. Because it's something like adults in their 50s now, at least in the States, and it's probably the same in Canada, are on something like 5 different prescription medications. Basically, everybody's on a statin and a blood pressure medication and metformin for type 2 diabetes or insulin or all these things. So so that's what I wanted to talk about is when something bad happens to us or seemingly bad. And again, I'm not talking about terrible, terrible things like the death of loved ones or facing your own mortality, coming to grips with it. I'm talking about losing a job, a mild diagnosis, a breakup, a have to move, running into people who are jerks. Because the story I want to just talk about is the Black Death. And if you are unaware of the Black Death, basically in the mid-14th century, in the 1350s or 60s, the bubonic plague ravaged all of Europe for about 2 years. Actually, it was a series of plagues. They almost even more terrible because the first plague wiped out about, some estimates are half of the population, 100 million people. Like, it was just unbelievable. Like, whole villages would be wiped out. And you can read some stories of that time, and it's just horrific what was going on and what people lived through. Like, nothing in my life will ever be as bad as that. I mean, I can't see it. I guess I shouldn't say that. I'm not dead yet, but it seems unlikely. And just as a side note, one way to practice gratitude that I do is I think about all the terrible things that are happening to me. It's easy to dwell on, liking someone and they don't like you back, or breakups or whatever. But it's also enlightening to think about, well, you know what? I don't live in a war zone. I'm not facing, a chronic or mortal illness that I know of, right? I don't have to think about where my next meal is coming from. Like, so many things that are not true of other people in the world, right? I can drink water and I know I'm not going to die from it. Like, these are things that are not true of other people. And I'm not saying that we should be happy because other people have it worse. It's not about relativism, but it's just about if you need to think about something to be grateful for, one exercise is to think about all the terrible things that aren't happening to you. So anyway, the Black Death. And I just another side note, it came back for like every decade or 25 years. It came back for a while. And because older people had some level or measure of immunity, when it came back, it mostly killed young people and children, which, again, just horrific. And there are stories, of parents, basically nailing their children inside the house so they die alone so that they don't get the parents sick. It's just awful. So as bad as that was, and I'm not here to say that was a good thing that it happened, because we'll see. But Europe at that time was in the grips of feudalism, and feudalism was an economic policy or economic government in which the land was owned by very few people, and peasants worked that land. And because there were way more peasants than there was available land, the landowners could treat them as miserably as they wanted, and people worked basically they got enough food just to stay alive, and they weren't able to save anything. And, somebody broke a leg. If the father broke a leg, the whole family was out and a new family was in. And they would work the land, and that family would probably go on to die. Just brutal, nasty conditions. There was even a practice called the prima nocta, which was when a new maiden that was getting married on the Lord's land, he had the right to spend the nuptial night with her. So he would have sex with all the maidens and probably fathered many of the children in his own. Anyway, that's a side point. But the point is that labor was so cheap and so abundant that this small number of people controlled everything. And without the Black Death, there was no compelling reason that economic situation would have changed. But what had happened after the Black Death went through and fields remained untilled because there was no one to work them, suddenly labor became expensive. And the lords of these lands had to start paying more money and more resources for people to come and work the lands. And because of that, you started to get a middle class. And that middle class, as it started to get richer, they started turning their attention to science and literature. And then you got the Renaissance that happened and the influx of information, from the ancients that had been lost to much of Western Europe. That also coincided with the fall of Byzantium, but also that just the influx of stuff and knowledge from the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, a lot of that, translated and saved by Muslims. So, without the Moors, I think specifically, and a lot of other Muslim peoples, a lot of that stuff would be lost. So as a direct result of the Black Death, you get a middle class, you get a turning towards science and art and literature and knowledge, and the Renaissance comes, and then the Enlightenment comes after that. And then again, people have leisure and they are starting to think about their situation, and you get philosophy, and then you eventually get the beginnings of what will become democracy. Prior to, the English Revolution in the 1600s and the death of Charles I, the thought was that, the king was anointed by God, and the power came from God through the king to the people. And Charles I basically invaded his own country and went to war against his own people, and he was tried for treason. And he said, I can't be tried for treason. I'm the king. My power is given to me from God. And Cromwell and the others said, no, we give you the people. It comes from the power from the people. And they convicted them and executed him. And then that was the British Revolution. And after that, things changed. The French Revolution came later, the American Revolution. And that was the seeds of democracy. That power did not come from divine God to a person. It came from the people up, which we still have, at least for the time being. We'll see when it goes. So once again, I'm not here to say that the Black Death was a blessing. What I'm saying is that we don't know all the repercussions from everything until the dust settles, right? We don't know what certain things will be good and what certain things will be bad. Again, if you were alive in the 1350s, it was horrific. And I am not here to say anything that it wasn't or that it was worth it. Again, none of that. Just that it's hard to think of anything. It's hard to think for me. I find it difficult to think in terms of absolute black and white. That something is wholly good or wholly bad. It's a mixed bag. And it might be bad for some places or good for some places and bad for others and vice versa. It may be neutral in some places. But this idea that we seem to have, this dichotomy of thinking of like good, bad, and that's it. There's no middle ground, is dangerous in my view, because it leads to tribalism. And, where are we right now? But we're tribing up like crazy. And, the extremes of both sides are polarizing everybody until the people in the middle they don't know what to do. Anyway, that's my thought about today is we'll see, good, bad, we'll see. When the I can't remember the man's name, the person's name, the team's name that invented or added the like book on Facebook, But their whole point to doing that was they thought, oh, it'd be nice, someone put something up, someone says, oh, I like that, and they acknowledge like a compliment. And little did they know when they invented that it would become so tied to people's ego, and that it would lead directly or indirectly to depression among younger people, and suicide, and self-harm, and all these terrible, terrible outcomes. The law of unintended consequences, and that goes good or bad. The law of unintended consequences. Didn't see that coming, and yet there it was. Everybody thought. I remember when the internet started in the early '90s. Everybody was like, "This is new. It's great. It's going to be amazing." And there was an interview with David Bowie at the time, and he was like, "We'll see. It's an alien life form. I don't know." And interestingly, just on new technology, Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, that's probably my pick for the dystopic novel from the last century that most closely predicted the future. It was written about 100 years ago, if I recall correctly. There's an interview with him in the 50s, and he's talking about television. And Mike Wallace, formerly of 60 Minutes, no longer with us, great journalist, was talking about television as a medium. And Huxley was like, I don't know. It seems like it's power, persuasion, and whatnot. And Mike Wallace is pushing back. He's like, it's great. It's like a teaching tool. And Huxley was like, sure, it is now, but you can already see the beginning of advertising and how that sways people's minds. And he was like, what happens in the future if and when, certain political ideologies capture the airwaves? To which Mike Wallace guffawed, like, that's never going to happen. Well, boy, oh boy, that Aldous Huxley, smart man, he predicted a lot. And that's exactly what we have today is, media, especially in the States, where in the 80s and 90s was owned by dozens of companies, is now owned by 6. There's 6 companies, and basically the same people serve on the boards of all of them. So, I know people like to make a big show of there's a huge difference between Fox and CNN, but the one thing that they both have in common are common shareholders, and they're both making money for shareholders, and they both carry water, not for us, but for, the richest people. The number one advertiser on CNN is, I think, Pfizer. And, I mean, this one might get some comments. Great. Okay. Well, you know what? That's all I have for today. Just we'll see. That's it. This is reserved judgment about the little things that happen that might first vex you. Like, okay, well, let's see what happens. I don't know. There's always another story to tell, another side to things. So that's it for me today. Thanks so much for joining me on this crazy ride, and I hope to see you again. Bye.